Okay, so I think we can start. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to our oil spill response knowledge transfer webinar series. This is our webinar 1. So my name is Lin Zhao. My colleague Tim Nedwed and I are working for ExxonMobil. We focus on oil spill response research. And Tim is, is my team lead. Actually, he is the real brain behind this webinar series. Tim will introduce our guest speaker, Alan Allen, in a few minutes. Before I turn it to him, I have a list of things I need to go over. So bear with me. So after the successful webinar series the team held last year, we thought that we should keep this platform. It's a great way to share knowledge. And the purpose for the new series webinar is to allow highly experienced and seasoned OSR experts to pass on their knowledge to the world. So we intended to host the webinar in a monthly basis, and it will be held every first Tuesday of the month, 9 to 10 a.m. US Houston time. We also intend to host the webinar indefinitely, depending on our response and whether we are able to schedule a suitable speaker. The format of the webinar will be similar to a conference. We give the speaker about 45 minutes to talk, and then we leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And the attendees can only ask questions through Q&A. We will read the questions to the speakers. So any questions that are not answered during the Q&A period, we'll go through them at the end of the webinar. And if anyone cannot stay long, we'll record the whole webinar session and we'll share the recordings soon after the webinar. And because this is the first webinar, so I thought, we give a little bit time for introduction, etc. So I scheduled the first webinar for 1 hour and 15 minutes. So basically, that's the the whole list I need to announce. And now I give the floor to Tim to introduce our guest speaker. Tim, you are.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Just a couple of quick things. I just want to let people know why I decided, well, Lynn and I decided to host this webinar series. And it's because I've been in this business, gosh, maybe 20 years now. And I was very fortunate I met Al at the very beginning of my career. But even before that, my sounding board and my mentor for oil spill response related things was Jerry Canaveri. And it was fantastic for me to have both someone like Alan and Gary and others to be my sounding board, because I come up with kind of harebrained ideas and I bounce them off of Al. And if he doesn't say that'll never work, he never says, oh, that's fantastic, that's the best thing I've ever heard. But if he's neutral, I feel pretty good about it. Same thing was with Jerry Canaveri. So I thought to try to let everyone have access to the kind of really vast amount of knowledge that we have. We're going to hold this webinar series, and it was very obvious to me that Al Allen should be the first speaker. I won't go into a lot of details, and Al's going to actually tell us about kind of his life and career history in the talk. But Al is probably, when we thought we were looking at, Lynn and I were looking for the most politically correct term, but he's the most seasoned expert I know in oil spill response, because I think he's been around doing oil spill response related things for a very long time. So I look forward to Al giving us a presentation about his life experiences and kind of key messages for oil spill response. So with that, Al, why don't you kind of share your screen and bring up your first slide, and I'm turning the floor over to you. Thanks.
All right, I hope that worked.
Yep, you're good to go.
All right. Well, thanks, Tim and Lynn. I appreciate your inviting me to be the first guest for this series. And I think it's really great to have this in light of how we all went through pandemic and discovered that virtual learning really has its merits. I think the one drawback is that sometimes you're asked to join a virtual session at 7 a.m. So thanks, Tim. I'm not used to being up this early now that I'm retired. You can see from the title that the hope was to do a 50-year overview of oil spill response technology and address some lessons learned along the way. Well, try to do that in 45 minutes. That's a real challenge. So what I'm going to try to do is limit the topics to some of the early observations and lessons that were learned and things, especially what not to do in the beginning. I'd like to talk about offshore spill response and as far as challenges and some of the achievements and really where we're going with needed improvements. And then if there's time, I'd really like to get into some of the fundamental factors for effective response. That is, excuse me, looking at total system assessment and how we can evaluate the potential performance of various types of responses. And I'm going to leave this session today to cover only offshore response. Obviously, in 45 minutes, there's no way that I could cover shoreline cleanup and Arctic response and all the other things that I'd really love to get into, but there isn't time. So I'm going to try to leave those out for now. And I want to mention at the start that it might help if I give you a little bit of a background. It'll be very quick on how I got into this business and how that then led to one of the involvements, for me at least, in one of the first really significant oil spills offshore. And through that experience, a lot of lessons started to be learned. Another thing is that when Tim asked me to do this, it was almost just too coincidental that I was reading a book at the time he asked. And when he said, could you do an overview on so-and-so, I heard the word overview and I thought, wow, this is a coincidence. I'm reading a book called The Overview Effect. It's by Dr. Frank White. And in this book, he addresses issues that come up with astronauts that go off into space, travel to the moon, and on their way back, perhaps they're looking at the Earth and they see it as almost like a marble out there in space, and they are so moved by this view. In fact, let me go ahead and pull that up. Here's that image that quite often astronauts will be just stopped in their tracks as they see something like this. And they are so moved that Dr. White started interviewing the astronauts, and he started about 35 years ago. And he's now in the 4th edition of the book. It's called The Overview Effect. And it really struck me that the overview the astronauts talk about in the book were so pertinent to some of the overview issues that I think we as spill response people need to be thinking about. Let me give you another view that they get as they get closer to Earth on the way home. And I like this because, you know, it shows the atmosphere is a very thin layer. We all know it is, considering the diameter of the Earth, what, around 8,000 miles, and the thin layer going out roughly 10 miles as far as the most dense part of it. And I like this image because it gives us an overview as well of not only the atmosphere, but the oceans. We realize, of course, how much of the surface they occupy, but again, it's a very narrow layer of water when you consider the size of the Earth. So when the astronauts were looking at the Earth, they were moved to recognize that we are all a part of a whole, all a part of this beautiful planet, and the respect that we must have for it in order to preserve it and treat it such that it will last and provide oxygen for us to breathe and provide water for us to drink. These all tie into where I'd like to go today in these discussions, to say, how significant are all of the things that we've been doing over these years? And I've been involved in this now for about 55 years. And I feel like we really have to recognize that not everyone feels exactly as we do when we're in this business. So reaching out to the public, reaching out to the media, and to a lot of people to help them understand how we see the significance of what we're doing tying into the overall health of our planet is really major. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, I'll tell you, this picture is worth more than 1,000 words. It's got at least another 1,000 memories in it. Now, I hope you can see my cursor as I move it around. This is a picture of Southern California, and this is Devereaux Point, or Coal Oil Point, referred to by some. And over here at this point is the University of California in Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara, the city of, is just out of the picture to the upper side, about 10 miles away. Well, as I look at this picture, I'm reminded that right about up here in the upper left was a building where I worked. And this was when I was, back in my late 20s and early 30s, where I moved into a job where, after having been in missile defense, believe it or not, nuclear physics, I was getting really tired of that kind of work. And so from my location of my business, I would run down at lunchtime and jog along these beaches, always wondering why I got so many tar balls between my toes and on the bottom of my feet. I have to be sure I had some kerosene-soaked rags so I could clean them afterwards. And I had a home that was right over here on the left, assuming, again, you can see my cursor. And so from my home on weekends, I could easily get down to the beach. And I took up diving. All of this because I was kind of curious about where's all this oil coming from. And lo and behold, as I got out on some of my first dives, I saw things on the bottom like this. This is a picture of a natural oil seep. The tar mound that you see right here is about 1 foot across. And these fresh little blobs of crude oil coming out from the seabed are stretching out and moving toward the surface. And they are the things that are causing the oil slick that you see here. This is the oil that is moving from a number of seeps all along this entire area. And I hope it shows up clear enough for you. On my image, I can see it as a light surface. Here's a drilling rig. Well, this amount of oil in a day is about 150 barrels a day, pretty significant. And it's been going on for the longest time. So diving on these seeps was something that I drug a couple of friends of mine from the same company I was working with who were able to dive. Fortunately, one of those guys also had a Cessna 150, and we would fly up and take pictures like this of the seeps, and we'd measure flow rates, and we were just having a great time studying natural oil seeps for fun. It was really just to stay sane because I was not enjoying my job working in missile defense. Well, one day we were looking out as we were diving on the seeps and surfaced on the boat. We looked out, we saw seaward some real activity going on. And there were a lot of boats and some aircraft flying around. And what we saw, I really obviously have a very sensitive mouse here. What we saw was this. As we flew out, one of the drilling rigs offshore, about 5 to 6 miles out, had a bubble of oil and gas coming up all around it. I remember it was a pretty stupid instantaneous image I had was like, wow, what a seep. No wonder they're drilling there. Well, you know, obviously that was not the case. The vapors in the air where we were flying were pretty strong, and we quickly increased altitude and got out of the area. But this whole thing really made an impression on me, and I got to thinking, what is going on? I wasn't familiar with the idea of a blowout. And so I took pictures, and I'll save you hours of discussion, but it was incredible how my boss, where I was working at the time, got a hold of my pictures. And I was also making calculations on the volume of oil that was spilling. And he ran out of my office when he saw these things. And next thing I know, he's back in my office saying, Ellen, I want to introduce you to Channel 4 here in the Santa Barbara News Press. And would you tell them what you told me here just an hour or two ago? I did. I don't know whether I'd call it the greatest mistake of my life, or whether maybe I should be happy because it launched a career. I had no idea that the spiller, Union Oil in this case, and I think I can use names, it's been so long ago, well over 50 years ago, that they had been estimating, I guess by somebody looking over the side, it's probably spilling around 500 barrels, maybe a day. I don't know how I ever came up with the number. My numbers, more carefully done, were showing it was at least 10 times bigger, about 5,000 barrels a day. Well, I got involved with groups like GOO, Get Oil Out, GOO. I started to be inundated by people who wanted to say, aha, you proved the oil companies were lying. And that was not the case. I had no idea what they had said. But it got me so involved that I ended up in litigation for about 2 to 3 years. And it turned out, gradually, people came around to realize that the numbers calculated were correct. And the spiller acknowledged it. Cases were settled. And from then on, I was out of the missile defense business because I got so many calls when there were spills. Can you come down here? Tell me how much oil we're spilling. But then two things like, what can I do about it? That launched a career. And it wasn't easy to figure out why it launched a career when you looked from within the marina in Santa Barbara in the days that followed that spill. This is what was going on. These guys are out there in these little boats broadcasting straw out onto the water, then picking it up with pitchforks and putting it into the drums on board. And then they're bringing it into the shoreline. And it was sad but comical to watch how primitive oil spill response was back then. And that was in 1969. You see some telephone poles back here in the background. Those were booms. They were securing them together with chain and putting some canvas around the connection between the poles and putting them out on the water to supposedly be containment barrier to hold the oil out of the marina or to pull it into corners of the marina inside so they could put straw on it and pick it up. This was not a good idea for a lot of reasons. I discovered through the dives that I was making in the area and flying over areas like this is just outstream, right outside the entrance to, I guess it was the Ventura River, if I remember right. And we had a storm, and you see that from the river waters going out into the ocean, it was an amazing amount of sediment loading. Well, the straw had floated into these areas along with the oil, and you still see some remnants of oil coming in here. All of this mess of oiled straw and emulsified oil for a good week after the blowout started were moving into these waters and sinking. And this is what it looked like on the ocean floor. We had a mayonnaise or type of material. I mean, it was just the consistency of mayonnaise. And it was a good 6 to 8 inches thick on the seabed, just offshore, and it extended out a good 50 to 100 yards offshore. diving in these areas, looking at the suffocation of anything and everything that was on the seabed was really upsetting and frightening. So as time went on, in those weeks of observing bad technique, watching what was going on, seeing the reaction of the public, witnessing what was going on with how, basically how the spiller was not acknowledging the severity of the spill. President Nixon came down finally very, very late. I believe it was the president of the oil company came in, and some really bad things were said. When he arrived at the airport, I remember watching on TV where he got off, and he said something about, what's a few dead birds? Can you believe? I mean, talk about insensitivity. And it was recorded and played on television, and people were just building enormous anger. And if any of you are old enough to remember the Santa Barbara blowout, 1969, you were certainly seeing an enormous outcry of the public. So what did we do about it? NOAA, fortunately, NOAA decided that those pictures, those findings of oil sinking on the ocean floor was something that needed to be investigated. And I was very fortunate because Roger, my pilot, who was with me in the missile defense business, well, he could join me along with a third individual, Lee, and Lee Fausick was his name, and Roger Schluter. Those two guys and me got permission and funding from NOAA to go down and stay in Hydrolab, and this is where we stayed. Hydrolab was a fantastic habitat on the ocean floor, about 50 feet down off the Bahama Islands. And we planned for quite a long time, about a year, to come up with experiments like you see in the lower left here. This is me with obviously needing glasses. I had the goggles that would allow me to see clearly. We had buckets of oiled sediment, and we would work with these oiled sediments and deliberately expose various types of plants and animals, a whole coral knoll, for example, to see how animals and plants reacted to oil as it sinks. And of course, this does happen naturally as well. After a storm, oil weathers, loses its lighter ends, and especially if it attaches to sediment or to the wrong stuff put on it to sink it, it ends up on the bottom. Some of the experiments we did was to put oil in these types of cylinders and leave it and come back a year later and see how much it had migrated, how much it had changed if it got covered up with more bottom sediments. We took some of these oiled sediments and put them into a screen in a frame like this, and we'd sift it. And you can see oil droplets attached to sediment being sifted over these coral knolls. And it was just a small, limited area, but a great deal was learned from that. So much so that really the concept of sinking agents or misusing of materials that end up sinking oil really took hold. And I feel like it was a worthwhile thing. So out of the Santa Barbara blowout, 1969, these were some of the things I feel like that were really early response shortcomings. They boil down to integrity, resources, tactics, and attitude. And, you know, the reporting of a spill quickly is really important, making sure that people know if it's something going on and it's severe and how is it going to impact their jobs, their lives, their use of the beaches. The resources that were available, they weren't existing at that time. Vessels, equipment, people, just not available. Tactics were terrible. Telephone poles for booms, straw being thrown out on the oil, sinking. Vac trucks, well, not a bad idea. Vac truck is a good thing, but you don't just take a 4-inch hose with no skimmer on the end of it and just plop it into the surface and expect that you're going to get a lot of oil. You're going to get about a fraction of 1% oil and the rest of it's water through that 4-inch opening. And the vac trucks were filling up with water, tiny bit of oil, and going away and emptying it somewhere. So equipment, people, tactics, and worst of all, the attitude, the corporate insensitivity, the rudeness that went on, the total lack of responsibility was something that I realized, man, if I were working in this area of oil spill response, not just testifying about it and witnessing it as a civilian, not getting paid for any of my efforts, if I was going to do that, there is a big job to do. I didn't know at the time, I didn't realize, but within a year, I had quit my job because I was getting so much in the way of questions, so much in the way of requests to go out and work on other spills, that I began to think about ways to improve how we clean up oil spills. By the way, the same guy that made the comment about, oh, what's a few dead birds? As he was leaving that day from Santa Barbara, he said something about, the people of Santa Barbara, they're just a bunch of Santa Barbarians. Can you believe it? That kind of a statement sticks with people. They lost their confidence that, you know, the industry was not really handling things well. So shortcomings in summary shown up here at the top. And all of those shortcomings led to distrust and litigation. And it turned out to be pretty expensive by standards at that time. If I remember, after my testimony, and I was about the only witness that survived because I'm kind of a nutcake on good data and good note taking, and signed every photo I took, and it held up in court. But when it was settled, I think they ended up spending, I don't know, between $10 and $15 million. Not much in terms of the spills that we've witnessed in the years to come, but back then that was a fair amount. There was public outcry and demonstrations that went on for years, still do to this day. There's people who remember it and complain about it, remember the way they were treated. Worldwide media explosion, there really was. Some people said it was like the shot heard around the world. This was the spill witnessed around the world. So a lot of things happened. New regulations came out of it, including the creation of EPA. A lot of acts like the National Environmental Policy Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, and on and on. There were several. A lot of lessons learned at that time. So what happened next? How did this event change attitude, funding, and the response to oil spills? Did it really do anything? The answer is a resounding yes. The challenges grew. I was so pleased to move into this as a full-time way of making a living, because it wasn't just the Santa Barbara blowout in '69 and a lot of spills in between, but in 1979, the IXTOC spill that happened off of Mexico was producing oil at such a higher rate. Back here in Santa Barbara, it was flowing at about 5,000 barrels a day. When I flew in and witnessed this spill at IXTOC and worked with the people on shore to get a helicopter, go out, take some pictures, witness the response, I made estimates there. It was 20 to 30,000 barrels a day, a major blowout from a depth pretty similar to the blowout, around 160, 170 feet. Only this one, unlike Santa Barbara, that only went on for about a week at 5,000 a day, so that was 50,000 total. And then over the next few months, maybe another 40 to 50,000 barrels in a slowed down rate. This one at this high rate produced like about 3.5 million barrels of oil over a 9-month period. This is a major, major release, and a lot of that oil made it to US waters and up along the shorelines of the coast of the US. Well, 10 years later, and it's just ironic, 69, 79, 89, we had the Valdez spill. All right, now here's a spill that it's a grounding. So there's no water depth of concern right there where the vessel is, but of course, just a short distance away out in Prince William Sound. The waters, of course, increased in depth fast. The amount of oil coming off of this was at an extremely high rate. Let's face it, there was about 260,000 barrels released during this spill. And it was released over, the bulk of it was released over just a few days. And that oil traveled quickly. I mean, when I arrived that morning, I got a call shortly after midnight, got down there in the morning, and it was like around 6 or 7 a.m., as I remember. So the oil had started shortly after midnight being spilled. It was already covering 6 to 7 square miles. And I have some pictures that show that. I won't have time to show them today, but it spread out and it was continuous, thick, black oil. And I, in the days that followed, did some measurements, and I found that that oil was typically on this icy cold water in Alaska was a couple of millimeters thick in those areas. 260,000 barrels. Well, you'd think 10 years later something else would happen. No, we had to wait till 2010, and there's the Deepwater horizon. Now here we're looking at obviously another major spill event. And with the Deepwater horizon, it's estimated that somewhere around 5 million barrels were released. And of course, that was released over just a little under 3 months. If I remember right, I think it was around 87 days. And during that time, the spillage of oil extended over a large area because it's bubbling up through now about 5,000 feet of water, about a mile of water depth. And you never knew day to day exactly where it would come up. The challenges were unique and really difficult to deal with. So here's a history of spills, things going on. All in between each of these spills were many, many other spills. And I had already, by the time the Deepwater Horizon blowout occurred, I had already worked on hundreds of oil spills and worked and trained and conducted trials and drills in nearly 60 countries by the time I retired just a couple of years ago. Throughout this time, the challenges continued to grow. And it was things like the time between spills that really created problems, one of which was complacency. It's hard to admit, but you get a big show, you get a lot of publicity, a lot of people complaining, and a lot of things happen. People get hired up, they create oil spill response teams. 10 years go by, and that company with the spill may kind of fall back, lay off a few people, maybe not buy as much equipment. Things happen, things changed. But at the same time, some of those people stayed on, and they became like myself and like all the others that hopefully are watching today. Many of them stayed in the business, and we contributed in a positive way to what's going on. The spill locations, the conditions at the times of these spills, all of these things really provided the challenges to create response capabilities that would make us ready when a major spill came along. And the industry moved on it. It's a positive picture. There were problems, there was some complacency, there was turnover of people, but for the most part, with new regulations coming about, many of which were for the right reason and really made things difficult for the industry to do their job without having good oil spill response plans, without having teams ready to roll. It was the cleanup costs, the claims that came about. All of these things added to this problem. And money was spent, time was spent, people were hired. The challenges continued. There was a need for backup support, contractors, vessels of opportunity. Other oil spill response organizations were needed. And we looked even at cross-border planning. How could we deal with an IXTOC type spill with waters that came from another country into US waters? There were such high costs, the need for facilities and equipment, vessels, aircraft. I had to do research and development, tank testing, full-scale field trials. All these things cost money, but it was done. The industry moved in a big way through the years that I was involved in it. There were a lot of common public misconceptions, like should, recover all the spilled oil? Could we do that? No. Anyone should be able to volunteer? No. We get into trouble when we accept volunteers without proper training. Chemical dispersants sink oil. No, they don't. But that was a misconception. It took years and it still is a problem. To this day, some people still think that the application of chemical dispersants sinks oil. It doesn't. It puts it into tiny, tiny billions of little droplets that can just decompose and gradually go back to a condition where the environment can handle it. So many misconceptions. The burning of oil offshore, they felt was dangerous and harmful to the environment. You see the smoke. In the beginning, the burning of oil just did not get supported. There was a sustained outreach and expectation management that was needed, and it was achieved. So when it came to burning and dispersants, regulators, the public, the media, schools, all of these groups needed to be educated on how burning and dispersants are actually viable, minimal impact ways of dealing with major oil spills. And that went on for many, many years and did get better with time. There was a need for enhanced system design and field trials, exercises, not demonstrations, improve skimming systems and booms, reduce operational limitations. All of these things went into trying to provide better ways of demonstrating to the public, conducting research so that we could come up with systems that would really work well. And the provision of incentives had to be there. There had to be employment opportunities, student funding and awards, contractor R&D support, purchase agreements. All of these things had to be there to provide incentives so that the enhancements for oil spill response could take place. And I witnessed that, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, major events took place to improve our spill response capability. So with industry responding, there was creation of dedicated joint industry oil spill response organizations. These existed around the country and spread throughout the world, in fact. There was enhanced communications and tracking between aircrafts, vessels, all of the things needed to mount major spill responses, and I witnessed that. There was an improved use of surveillance and spotting techniques, aircraft, balloons, tethered drones, visual IDs, AIS, all of these things really contributed to making our response better. So there was an expanded operational window, light level imaging, illumination for night operations, infrared, radar, microwave, all of these things contributed in a big way to our response capabilities. The vessels, skimmers, induction pumps, booms, boom vanes, storage and transfer systems, all of these things enhanced our response capability, and there was a serious move to make this happen. The use of controlled burning really caught on. People began to see from small spills to even the large spills, where as fire booms could be developed to hold burning oil in place, and aerial and surface igniters could be used effectively. A lot of these things developed into proven safety and operational protocols so that burning started to be recognized as a viable technique. Dispersants, it's been up and down on that one. People still think you're throwing chemicals out an oil slick, you're just making it worse. It's trade-offs. Everything we do, of course, involves trade-offs. And with chemical dispersants, surface, aerial, injection systems, all kinds of techniques, we began to see and convince enough people that putting chemical dispersants on an oil slick results in a relatively small window of impact. And in fact, putting the oil into billions and trillions of tiny little droplets that can decompose and break up very fast is a lesser impact than letting that oil come ashore. The people who looked at controlled burning, if perhaps in a fire boom at sea, they'd see the black smoke. The smoke only lasted for a matter of an hour or two before it spread and was hardly visible. Now, granted, it's adding particles to the air, but they're very limited in terms of the region of impact. And when you compare what we're doing with the burn and chemical dispersants to the impact of that oil, if we had let it go and it came ashore in biologically sensitive areas near shore, those techniques began to really take hold and look good. So with time, people started to recognize that there were things we could do that would really improve our response capabilities. And I throw this one in because of all the things that were done, there was really a top priority that was recognized, as we knew that if you couldn't see what was going on and direct what was going on, you were at a loss trying to view it from just vessels on the surface. And it took trained people to go up and conduct visuals such that they could keep the activities organized. They could do periodic high altitude surveillance, for example, to identify where the heaviest oil was. And then they could position vessels and aircraft so that skimming and burning and dispersants could all be carried out in meaningful ways. This is a picture of me. I know I look nice and neat and clean in this picture. That's because in an airplane, you're not getting gooey. But working from the aircraft, we had a good bird's eye view of what was going on, and we could see what was happening to protect wildlife, to organize vessels, to monitor the burns that were being done. For a while, we did it from helicopters, but after a while, we realized that fixed wing and all of these advantages listed here on the side come into play. Comfortable seating, ample workspace, convenient restroom on board, radio communications with the pilot. In this case, what I'm doing is I've got a radio in my hand where I'm talking to the vessels down on the surface, helping to give them guidance to move them into the areas where the heaviest oil concentrations exist, and communicating as well back to command to let them know what's going on. There was good viewing, especially with an overhead wing. Some of the aircraft we flew had a lower wing, and it limited our viewing, but by having aircraft that were suitable for good viewing, we could guide the operation, stay on location long enough, and have enough aircraft that we could fly another aircraft out while one went back to refuel. And that kind of guidance from the air really helped a great deal in terms of making sure that skimming boats and burns and dispersant application were carried out on the heaviest concentrations of oil. During the spills, I would say, especially the spills in the Gulf of Mexico, where it was covering huge areas, oil surfacing over an area that was well over 100 square miles, 10 by 10, was easily every day faced with oil surfacing. We needed to have many teams in mechanical, burning, and dispersants going on, and it took this kind of aerial support to make sure that they were in the right place, doing their jobs the best way they could. So total response system assessment. Looking at mechanical recovery, things were done such that we could improve vastly how these operations would be carried out. Same way with the burning operations. Here a fire boom is shown with the burning of oil inside. And the application of chemical dispersants. All of these operations had to be coordinated on these spills that took place in the last 10 to 20 years. There was one burn done during the Exxon Valdez spill, only one burn. And that's when the storm came in. Yeah, I believe it was Easter weekend. Spill was what, on a Friday, and I think within 2 or 3 days we had a storm come in, and the oil was so scattered that the rest of the time was mostly on shoreline cleanup. So with these kinds of activities at sea and trying to refine everything that was going on in terms of better understanding the relationships between swath, speed, average oil thickness, we began to recognize that there are limitations on how much oil we can access. Certainly systems were improving constantly. You're looking at like an ocean buster system here with lead booms to deflect oil into it, hold the oil, release water out the bottom, and then be able to either pull this system up. Sometimes it would be operated right alongside of the towing vessel so that they easily reach over with skimmers into this pocket and recover the oil. The whole operation was such that you could eliminate even one of the boats towing this boom. This is a boom vane out here, another advanced part of technology that we were witnessing over these last 10 to 20 years. Really useful tools that sped up the operation, but keeping track of speed, swath, average thickness really allowed us to start to do some things like evaluate what is the oil encounter rate, knowing the swath, speed, and the average thickness of the oil we're encountering, to make calculations on what is the total fluid rate potential. And that's where you start to get into the efficiencies, the throughput, recovery efficiencies. How much water do you pick up with the oil that you get? How much oil escapes under your containment booms? That affecting the efficiencies of the operation. And when you feed those in, you can calculate them and come up with things like a maximum effective swath. That was really a breakthrough in terms of beginning to understand what are the connections between the science of oil spill response, and that applied to mechanical, burning, and dispersants. A system's total fluid recovery rate, when it equals its nameplate oil recovery rate, you're at a point where if you try to pick up more oil by increasing swath or speed, it's just going out the back. Your throughput efficiency is going down. Your recovery efficiency is going down. So we found a way mathematically to begin to understand what are the swaths and the speeds that we can work with in an effective way for different types of oil in different thicknesses for the kind of encounter rates we'd get. The recovery potential of a skimming system could be determined for its ability to encounter, contain, recover, store, and offload recovered oil and water. That really was a breakthrough that came about just in the last 5 to 6, 7 years, where when Jen West, a company here in the Seattle area, working together with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, Bessie, did studies that really resulted in major breakthroughs of understanding scientifically how each of the response systems could be conducted in a meaningful way. There were planning calculators that were created, and I've listed some of them right here. There was an estimated recovery system potential calculator and an estimated dispersant system calculator, and on and on. These were all valuable tools that were created. They're free, they're available to anyone. These calculators give you scientifically proven, mathematically worked out ways to evaluate the best way to stage your equipment, to use it in a meaningful way with the right swaths and speeds for different conditions that you have to operate in. And shown on the bottom of this slide is the website where you can go to access these calculators. They can be downloaded for free. I strongly urge that people become familiar with these calculators if you're not already. So just a few last words. I see that we're getting close to the time when I should start to be quiet and open up for questions and answers. Contained burning of oil was so advanced during the Deepwater Horizon spill. Only one burn was done during the Valdez spill, but here we did a lot more, and we learned how to capture and ignite oil within fire boom. We filled some of those booms entirely, as you see right here. This is the feeding of oil. In fact, look at the emulsification of this oil going in. Very high in water content, but because of the intensity of the burning inside this boom, that emulsion is breaking down and we have a sustained burn. And these went on for hours with just 2 boats pulling a length of maybe about 500 feet of fire boom behind it. The burns were very effective. Yeah, the black smoke looks terrible, but it was a short-lived, localized impact that was tolerated, and we could conduct multiple burns like this. Sometimes oil would escape. Maybe the boom with time would wear out. Some of the oil would escape. And in the beginning, what we found was that by accident, the oil spilling out would burn for a considerable period of time behind the boom. Turns out that's a really good way to get rid of a lot of oil. Because of the rising hot air from this fire, it creates winds around the periphery of the burn that just pull in oil to the fire and hold it in place. It's acting like its own containment system. And those fires sometimes went on for many hours, where oil could be burned behind a boom that was in the failing mode. If you towed a boom too fast, you could spill oil under it and over it, and some of that oil would catch fire. In all of the estimates that were done for the amount of oil burned, we really didn't include a lot of these freestanding burns without containment. So the amount of oil burned was far in excess of the numbers that in situ burning was given credit for. These are a few of those burns taking place simultaneously. And you can see it's a very calm day. It was very easy to contain the oil, but a great deal of oil could be burned. Out of 400 burns conducted, there were about 376 of them that were really significant in size. And we estimate that we burned well over 300,000 barrels of oil. Now that is a significant dent in the amount of oil that was being released. Dispersants played a big role as well. The many platforms that can be used for dispersant application, constantly learning how to better use dispersants and apply them in a meaningful way. Supply was always a big problem with dispersants on a major spill. During Deepwater Horizon, it was moved in quickly. Aircraft were changed out quickly, refueled, reloaded with dispersant, and flown. The dispersant use issue finally was being recognized, as well as burning, during the Deepwater Horizon spill, because we had good surveillance. Canada provided aircraft that assisted in the higher altitude, broad surveillance mode. And then by working with things like the King Air, even though it's a lower wing aircraft, still provided really good platform for keeping booms moving into the heaviest oil concentrations. The dispersants were getting better all the time too. We were moving to dispersants that were of relatively low toxicity, were more effective in terms of dispersing the oil. And it really has built over time a history of worldwide use. I think burning dispersants are now no longer looked at as alternative response options. We've got to stop using words like that. These response options over the 50 plus years that I've been in this business, they're finally becoming recognized as important primary response options. So in summary, I'd like to say, don't spill oil. That's an obvious one, because it costs big time to clean it up, and the impact on the environment can be significant, especially in shallow waters, near shore. It's important to report spills and provide timely updates. Unlike what was happening in the Santa Barbara spill, where it was delayed for many days, the public was irate. Avoid early spill volume estimates. We've learned that the hard way over the years. Anyone involved in a spill is best to hold off on saying how much was spilled because it can change. But what you give out the first time seems to stick, and it may end up to haunt you. Mobilize robust initial response. It's like, it's always better to respond with all of the arsenal, all of the people you can get, and then just adjust and cut back as appropriate. If you don't need them, let them go, but be there as early and as quickly as you can to take care of that spill. And confirm with surveillance and spotting. Make sure that where you are is the best place to be, and give direction to the operations on the ground so that they continue to work within those heaviest concentrations. Consider pre-authorization operations. Now, what I mean by that is, you may not have approval because both burning and dispersants require approval. They require authorization for use on any given spill. But it doesn't hold you back from going out there with an aircraft and being ready. Be ready to apply dispersants at the moment a radio call comes in that says you have authority, permission right now, go ahead and spray. And you can begin the operations. And the same thing for spraying dispersants from boats. Get out there, have the dispersants ready, be ready to roll. And for the burning as well, there's nothing wrong with deploying fire boom, collecting oil in it, build up at least 500 to 1,000 barrels of oil easily just in the lower 1/3 of the area of a boom, possibly 20, 30,000 barrels within a single boom, have it ready. And when the approval comes through for ignition, you're off and running. Consider pre-authorization for operations with the burning and dispersants so that we do not lose time. And then sustain community outreach. Man, this is so critically important. If we don't get out and talk to the public, talk to the media, educate them, involve them in our exercises so that they understand what the limitations are, so that they have a good filter for trade-offs. Everything we do in this business is a trade-off. They've got to be at a point where they understand not only what the limitations are, but that we're very likely never to be able to collect and recover all of the oil, or to burn and disperse all of the oil. Oil spreads so quickly, we realize that. But if they understand what the limitations are, they're more easily willing to buy in. Honesty, integrity in the release of that information is critical. And document and record all of the decisions and all of the approvals. Document the operations, because it's very likely to end up in some way in litigation and some forms of suits. So to the extent possible, use the VESI and the GenWist planning calculators. I can't say that enough. Those are ways to bring science to the business of oil spill response. It's going to help out a lot in making sure that you buy all these OSROs, make sure they buy the right equipment, to all of the agencies who monitor and witness and evaluate the response capabilities, that they understand the science of each of the response options that we have. Well, next time around, you have a much prettier speaker coming in, Ann Hayward Walker. She's the gal. Boy, I'll tell you, if all of the things of intelligence and integrity and just a gal who has so much depth of knowledge about oil spill response. If that can be packaged in one person, it's Ann Hayward Walker, and you're going to have the privilege next month of listening to her. You got to love her. She's a great gal. Well, I think I've probably talked long enough. I think it's about time to open up Q&A. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Al. As Lynn said, we scheduled this for an hour and 15 minutes, but as we did last year, there's always more questions than we can answer in the questions period. So if people want to stay over, Al's agreed to stay over and answer the questions.
I'd be happy to do that.
Questions are coming in. Hey, let me just say a couple things before we go to the questions, and I see questions are coming in, but Al is too modest. So I want to say two things. The first is, I told Al when we had our practice session that Al is now a published author. and he needs to take this opportunity to move some units. So if you look over maybe it's a mirror image here, but your right shoulder, your left shoulder, I'm not sure. He has a book that you can go on Amazon and sell. And I'm going to give Al a couple minutes or however much time he needs to plug his book. Go Al.
Oh, I'm sure there's questions that are much more important about oil spill technology and response. But now, since you opened up the door, this is the book. And thank you, Tim, for mentioning it. And what's important is just know that finally, after all these years in the oil spill business, I wrote a book and it has nothing to do with oil spills. And it's not a spiritual book. You might say it's not a religious book, but here's what it is. The subtitle: A Discovery of Clues for the Greatest Puzzle of All, the Purpose of Life and Beyond. Woo. So what I did was, during the pandemic, I had time to sit down and finally write all of the things that have happened to me over my lifetime, from the time I was 2 years old and my parents told me about the things happening to the current time. I should have died about 20 times. And many of those events are so incredibly mystical that my kids, my grandkids, and even my great-grandkids now are telling me, Grandpa, you got to write these things down. And so I did. It's a light read. It's fun. And I'm not here to advertise it, but thanks for bringing it up, Tim. It's available on Amazon. Anybody can find it, and you can read it in a night if you like.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm gonna get it, but great. I think that's fantastic, Al. The other thing, so I'm going to turn it over to Lynn in a second, but I just wanted to mention one other thing. I think it's because of Al's modesty, and maybe I can turn this into a question, Al. And the question is, do you still agree with this? So after Deepwater Horizon, it struck me that the in situ burning treated quite a bit more oil than the mechanical recovery operations, right? If the estimates are correct, somewhere around 7% was burned and only 3 or 4% was mechanically covered if the estimates are accurate, right? And it struck me, and I remember listening to Al during his course, I mean, you only had, what, 7 to 10 in situ burn units going at any time and at max?
Yeah, that's typical, yeah.
Yeah, and then, but the mechanical recovery operations, there was an order of magnitude or more, 20, 30 more systems doing mechanical recovery. So it struck me that why were you able to burn so much oil compared with an order of magnitude fewer systems in mechanical recovery systems? And Al's comment to me, and I want to see if you still agree with this. And it's an important lesson for, I think, a large oil spill like that, in that the spotter, the person who was in the plane directing the operations, needs to be dedicated to moving the vessels in to each individual oil slick. Yeah. And the issue with mechanical recovery was there wasn't enough spotter planes in the air. So the mechanical recovery spotters were trying to direct 10 systems at once. And so they go over and say, okay, this oil's over here, move this way. And then they go to another system and say the oil's over here. Well, you need to be on top of those systems until they get into the heavy oil and start doing their operations. And if you're sidetracked on something else, you really, really lose efficiency. So having eyeballs like Al's on it, who has a huge amount of experience, is fantastic, but I'm not sure you'd say you have to be there. You just have to have enough spotter aircraft, and they can't be sidetracked on a dozen different systems because they're going to make all of them inefficient. Do you still agree with that, Al? Because I think that's
absolutely.
That's a lesson we should have in the future to make sure we don't over deploy mechanical recovery systems and not have enough surveillance aircraft.
Oh, that's such a good point, Tim. And that's why I threw in that one slide that kind of gave the comparison of, say, the advantages of a fixed wing aircraft versus a helicopter. I flew in helicopters several times, getting a window seat, just a platform on which to work, a table to take good notes, the comfort of it, the whole thing. And if you're up there for hours and you got to go to the bathroom, it's hard in a helicopter. The King Air and other small fixed wing aircraft were great platforms, but you're right. Spotting is so critical to those operations. And that's what we found during the Deepwater Horizon. A lot of time and effort is needed to train surveillance and spotting personnel.
Okay. Well, look, we're getting a bunch of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, and if you want, Lynn, you can start just going down the list of questions. I see the first one is a comment, but maybe the second one is.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. That's a great presentation. You know, it's like, you know, the history of the oil spill response that, you know, for us, for our like newbies, so we, you know, we didn't know. So let me go over this. So the first one is just a comment from Linda Manka, and he worked with you before, and he's really he's really you know, enjoy your talk. Can you, Alan, you can even open up the Q&A. You can click the Q&A and you can see the questions if you like.
Oh,
next, yeah. So next question from Art Power said, what books do you recommend for the audience to research all the lessons learned from the big spills since Santa Barbara in 1969?
Oh my, there's libraries filled with this information. It's really surprising. There's a lot of information out there, and you have to be selective. If you're more interested in mechanical cleanup, for example, there's books on that alone, and burning and dispersants. Just go to the International Oil Spill conferences. Look at the proceedings from those conferences. Those are great places to pick up good reading material. The internet is just filled with sources of information. I refer to it frequently. I know I'm retired, but I still like to do a little bit of advisory work once in a while. And I go to the internet all the time to get information on the latest technology. Man, you know, we're moving out with great things. Tim is very active with things like self-propelled vessels, small boats that can do things like towing boom, deploying napalm, spraying it out to ignite an oil slick contained in a boom. Tons of things like that can do. The technology, it's available out there. Yeah.
Okay.
Internet and the International Spill Conference, good sources.
Great. So Jacqueline Michelle gave a you know, reference for a recent report for some information. Let me see.
Oh, that looks good. Study of spills greater than 20,000 barrels. Thanks, Jackie. Wonderful to see you attending this.
So let's see if many thanks, you know, to your presentation. And this is a question, right? Given the historical record of a very low recovery rate achieved with offshore mechanical recovery system, do you think that continued emphasis on mechanical recovery at the expenses of other approach is justified?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I mean, let's face it, mechanical recovery is the only thing that doesn't need authorization. They can be moving out in a big way immediately. And it is important to overreact and then cut back as necessary, but send the troops out there, get as much equipment as you can on the spill, if it's a significant spill and you think you're going to need it. But mechanical cleanup is always going to be a very important part of it. Just look at what MSRC has done, for example, with their large spill response boats and so much other equipment, emphasizing mechanical cleanup. But they're coming around too with the burning and dispersants. They've got Fireboom. They're going to, I think, even 737s, looking at those for dispersant application. You know, advancements are being made all the time. So we're going to see burning and dispersants. We're highly recognized for the potential that it provides and accepted. Hopefully pre-authorization is going to start to play into certain spill events so we don't waste time. But mechanical, we always need it.
Yeah, let me just say, I agree with you, Al. Most spills are small and close to, right? That's why we put equipment in strategic locations. So most spills are small and close to equipment stockpiles. And if you can mechanically recover a significant amount of oil you should mechanically recover. That's the only thing that puts the oil back in the container where it came from, right? So mechanical recovery is always going to be the most important oil spill response tool, because most spills aren't Deepwater Horizon spills. When you get to the tier 2+ tier 3 type of spills, that's where we got to broaden the aperture, right? And it's really important to continue the education and outreach process that you mentioned to make sure that response options, in addition to mechanical recovery, are viable, because Mother Nature can be in charge. Well, Mother Nature is in charge of these very dynamic oil spills, and as they grow in size, it can overwhelm the ability to do things at the speed of boats.
Yeah, that's right. And keep in mind, I mean, depending on sea state, wind conditions, visibility, each response option has its own special conditions under which it is less limited. I mean, dispersants, clearly water depth. We can't do it in really shallow waters because of the temporary, localized, increased hydrocarbon levels in the near surface waters. So we can't be in really shallow waters for that to be the best place for it. Burning, we could do that on 2 or 3 inches of water in a marsh. You know, I mean, it's not limited by water depth. Mechanical, anywhere, as long as whatever booms and skimmers or boats you've got can work in that depth of water. So looking at the limitations on all of them, there's room for all 3 options. And anyway, there's a lot of improvement that can still be made, but it's sad when I think about it, how the public in general, unfortunately, thinks that big oil can't be trusted. That's changing. I really think it is. People are finally coming around to realize, because of our outreach to the schools in particular, work we did in Alaska, going out to the schools was really meaningful, because people started to discover it's not just fuel that's produced by oil, crude oil taken out of the ground. It's thousands of products, excuse me, really critically important products. And the students are realizing it. They're growing up. The image of the oil companies is changing. And the more that they get out for outreach and work with the schools, work with the agencies, and bring them up to speed on really what are the limitations of response and how serious industry and us contractors and everybody who's worked in this field are about doing our job and doing it right, the better off we'll all be. Great.
So another question from Ken. I agree to see you up and running 110%. Any comments or recommendations on intergovernmental global response initiatives?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Any comment, recommendations, intergovernmental global response initiatives? Whew. Hey, Ken, I'm going to have to get back to you on that one. I have to give some serious thought to it. I don't have anything right off the top that I can say, other than the fact that we've got to continue to support the International Oil Spill Conference, and even like we did this past one, where we did it all almost remotely, it was still a valuable way to communicate and stay current on the technology. And Interspill, another really important way in Europe quite often to get the most knowledgeable people in there, and the public and the agencies, and bring them up to speed on what is the latest technology, what can we do to prevent as well as respond to oil spills.
Okay, another question. Thank you, Alan, for the presentation overall. And any comments on reasoning and the use of dispersant?
Any comments on the use of dispersants?
Yeah, why we use dispersant? Yeah.
Well, as I already mentioned, I guess one of the biggest limitations is to make sure we've got good mixing energy, good water depth, and good spotting, so that the oil is applied appropriately. One of the big problems with aerial application of dispersant is that you may have a good spotter, and when you apply the dispersant, if you haven't taken into consideration the wind effects, the targeting of the dispersant landing on the thickest part of the oil is really a challenge. And so applying dispersant from vessels can be done. It can be done effectively. But again, it's outreach. It's making sure that the people on the boats, as well as the spotters and the pilots in the aircraft, know what the limitations are, understand how to apply the dispersants in the most meaningful way. That's a whole area we could spend another half hour at least on just ways to improve and effectively use dispersants.
It looks
let me say,
yeah.
sorry, Lynn,
Yeah.
let me just say that
go ahead.
we're just beyond our time, but we still have 120 people online. I just want to say thanks to Al. Ann Hayward, thank you. Next month will be Ann Hayward Walker, so we're really looking forward to that. Al, you set the record for the most attendees that we've had, almost 200 people at one point, and we still have 120 people listening. So before we lose all of them, I wanted to thank you and thank Ann Hayward for next week. And then we're going to have another. Lynn and I are going to scratch our heads about who's the next speaker, but beware, I'm looking at the names of people that are on the attendee list, and we will be emailing many of you because I see a lot of seasoned folks that listen to this talk that we're going to want to reach out to and have give a similar type of presentation on lessons learned. So Lynn, with that, I'll turn it over to you. I'm not sure, I'm seeing mostly comments on this question and answer pane, but maybe you've seen additional questions.
Yeah, there are a few questions. Still have a few questions left, I guess.
So you're good to stay, right, Al? Is okay?
Yeah, we're good to stay.
The only thing I have left to do today is go play golf.
Oh, well, that's
and it's so early here. I can get a full game in easily. I'll stick around as long as there's people that have questions.
Yeah. So just a follow up on Tim mentioned next week. Our speaker will be Hayward Walker
next month.
Next month. Yeah. So the webinar will be held on September 7th. I will send you an invite shortly after this webinar. Just stay tuned. So it looked like you have a book fan. I believe and said he already read your book. So congratulations on your book. I think there is another question. Do you think that by using drones instead of spotter planes would facilitate the mechanical recovery operations?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, not just the balloons, but somehow maybe tethering the balloons, or maybe working with drones to be tethered to, let's say, a pair of boats that are conducting, say, a burn operation, so that they're bringing along with them something that can stay with them, look ahead, see where the heaviest concentrations of oil are, and guide them into it. Something like that can also direct its view so that it can see the size of the burns. And that's really important because we need to do volume estimates of how much oil we burned. And if we know that a given area of oil is burning and it burns for 20 minutes, that's all we need, because we know what the burn rates are for oils of different types. And we can calculate then how much oil was likely burned. So having tethered balloons and other ways of just viewing the operation really is critical. It helps a lot. It frees up aircraft so that they can do some broader surveillance and spotting for other operations too.
Hey, let me just second that quickly, Alec. I learned in a field exercise that we did in 2016 that even man overboard boats, which are about 20 foot long, like bass fishing boats, right? And in very calm conditions, which it was almost like the Mediterranean offshore of Norway in 2016 when we did a field demonstration and had oil on the water. The guys in those boats could not see the oil slick over the side of the vessel. We wanted them to spray herders around the perimeter of that oil slick, and they were cutting through the oil slick, and we're sitting on the bridge of the large vessel that was overseeing operations. And we're like, what are those guys doing, right? It was like Keystone Cops, because they were cutting right through the oil slick, which is exactly what you don't want to happen when you're trying to burn a continuous. oil slick. So they were making these fire breaks in the oil slicks, which wasn't helping things. And we quickly realized that they couldn't see the oil, right? We could see it from the infrared cameras and things on the bridge, but by the time we could relay that information that we got off of the video cameras via a radio to the captain of the man overboard boat, he'd be halfway through the oil slick. And by the time he realized you're going through the oil slick, well, he'd be almost through the oil slick, but instead of just, that would have been better just to go completely through the oil slicks. Instead, he'd hit the reverse, back up and slice the oil slick again.
Yeah.
And so what the solution to that was for the captain of that of those man overboard boats doing those operations, if he had the video feed from a tethered drone over his head and came directly to him, those kinds of mistakes would not have been. It's a simple solution, but those kind of mistakes would not have been happening if there wasn't a middleman. So even, you know, you're up in an airplane, the communication channels are fast, but they may not be even fast enough. So having the direct link to some video with a drone, a tethered drone, which takes away a lot of the safety issues of drones, to each vessel that's doing some kind of response, I think that is really a key thing that needs to happen.
Absolutely.
In the future.
Yeah, good points. Thanks for reinforcing it. Boy, I agree 100% on that one.
Okay. Next question. What is your opinion about the challenges to respond to the new type of oils? For example, new generation of low sulfur fuel oils, as it seems the existing recovery system are not so efficient.
I guess I'd have to admit some ignorance in that area. I haven't really been personally involved in the selection of response options for some of the more extreme types of oils. I do know that we learn a lot from mesoscale type experiments and even bench scale experiments in the lab, where we can try to get a feel for the combustibility of an oil slick, the dispersibility of an oil. And so all these different types of oils, we need to look at them. I think too that even with mechanical cleanup, we're going to have to be sure that these oils are going to stay on the surface long enough to justify the mechanical cleanup and to really justify access even for burning. So that's a tough one. I'm sure many other people watching can probably give a better answer to that.
Well, let me just say that the challenge with these very low sulfur fuel oils, and it's a fraction of them, but some of them have high pour points. And if you're boating across the North Atlantic and the pour point may be significantly below the ambient temperature, right? And so that's a challenge if the oil immediately gels. We've looked at a number of them, and those types of high pour point, very low sulfur fuel oils are not, they're not all high pour points. So some of them are would act like a normal oil. So the challenge is, right, you know, the challenge is if you go above the pour point, all your response options become, if the oil is in a temperature well below its pour point, all response options become quite challenged because the oil just doesn't flow anymore. So it can't take dispersants. You might be able to burn it if you can get it thickened and ignited, but thickening it would be a challenge if it's not fluid, right? So there is a bit of a challenge, and industry is looking into what needs to be done to help us efficiently respond to the small subset of very low sulfur fuel oils that might have these issues.
Yeah, these things like changes in the properties of oil with time really are difficult to deal with from a response standpoint. I think back on an example back in the days when I was diving on the natural oil seeps. There would be days when we'd fly and we'd say, my gosh, what's happened? There's hardly any oil on the surface. And we knew the seeps hadn't stopped. But what we would do is we'd go out and we'd check, we'd dive, and sure enough, it was amazing. If we'd had some heavy rainstorms and a lot of fresh water had come out, and it's basically on the surface because the sea is calm maybe that day, the seep oil is about a 10 to 12 API type oil. I mean, that stuff just barely floats in salt water. And so we'd see the seep oil coming up, slowing down, and then spreading out that the interface between the sea, salt water, and a layer of fairly fresh water from the storms and the rains from rivers emptying into the ocean. So, you know, I mean, changes can be subtle, really simple, but they can take the oil off the surface and not make it available. A lot of funny things going on out there when the oil starts weathering.
Okay, so we have a last question, I think, from a person from Chevron in Perth, Australia. So he is a logistics section chief in a unique part of the world and interested in the comment to effectively go big with a robust initial response. Is this the lesson or most common opportunity missed for the logistics team to take away from today's discussion? What's your comment?
Oh man, I hope people take it away. The Coast Guard learned that that lesson decades ago. I remember there was a report that came out. I think it was something like trying to do too much with too little, and the Coast Guard was embarrassed by some of the responses going on oil spills. And I think people started to realize, you know, it's far better to spend a little too much money in the beginning, but be there with all of the resources you can possibly throw at it, as long as it's safe and reasonable to do, obviously. And then just cut back. If it turns out the spill isn't as big as you thought it was, or as serious, and you can handle it with half of the resources that you have, then just cut back. It's a really good technique. I think over-respond, take it seriously, notify people right away, warn everybody something's going on, and you're on it, and you're paying attention to it, and you're responding. Yeah, it just makes such a big difference from an integrity standpoint, honesty, and responding in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Great. So I think we don't have a question anymore. It's all like, thank you so much for your presentation. And even though we still see, you know, people, you know, there are still around 60 people so hang on with us. So is there any, you know, last comments? Team Alan?
Are you asking the audience, or were you asking for a comment from me?
From you, your team.
Well, I have to say, as I look at some of the comments, thank you. And like people like Jim Payne, thank you. I see comments about my book. That's always nice. It was a lot of fun writing it. And I'm getting responses from people around the world that thank me, because maybe they had a recent loss of a family member and they found that it was helpful in giving them hope for what's beyond this world. And that to me has been, I guess, one of the most satisfying things as I move into this senior phase of my life. And I hope it's of some value to others as well. Thank you, though, for today. This was a great, fun thing to do. You know, doing a brain dump, if you will, in less than an hour is kind of tough. Well, maybe unless you have a smaller brain, but you know, this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, and I think the future lectures are going to be really great. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just add that. Thanks, Alan. And I've learned, you know, we did this last year for 10 weeks, and it was really an eye opener for me. I was always, during the initial parts of the lockdowns last year, I'm like, oh gosh, another Zoom meeting and another Zoom meeting. But there are big advantages to this Zoom meeting, and the ability to transfer some of Al's knowledge to over 190 people is something that I don't think we'd be able to easily do in person. And so the big advantage here is being able to speak to so many people, Al. I think that's fantastic. And then we are recording this. Hopefully, we've had hiccups in the past with the record button, but it seems to be working and holding. So the intent here is that these recordings will be saved. And we're going to talk to the API, because they have a website that can be accessed more easily than anything we have, and place them on an API website. on their oil spill response pages. So anyone can access it. So it takes us a little time to get the nuts and bolts figured out for doing that. But when we do, Lynn will send out a note on exactly how people can access it, because I know some people couldn't listen to everything, and then we had invites and a lot of people couldn't actually attend because they weren't willing to get up at 7 a.m. or something, I don't know. But it'll be there for posterity. And so all this knowledge that we heard today, which is fantastic, is going to be captured.
And,
so
let me just throw in, Tim, real quick, that if anybody wants to contact me at any point, my email address is very simple. It's just my first name, Alan, A-L-A-N, at spilltech.com. And I don't know how to spell Spilltech. It's only with one L and no H. So Alan at spilltech.com, spiltec.com. And I'd be happy to have conversations, phone calls, whatever, emails. It's just fun to stay active. And we have such a wonderful field of people out there. It's kind of cool in retirement to still be staying active with the group. Thanks a lot.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, thank you all. Thank you,
Okay.
team, and thank you everybody still hanging with us.
All right.
And yeah, we'll finish today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining.
All right.